In 1963, British government scientists released live bacteria inside the London Underground. Commuters carried on walking, unaware that researchers were tracking how a biological attack could spread through the tunnels, and how many people might be exposed. But that experiment began with something far deadlier, tested on a Scottish island that remained contaminated for nearly half a century. By the end, you'll know what Britain created there, why the island was abandoned, and what finally forced the government to clean it. Picture yourself boarding a train in London on July 26, 1963. You stand beside office workers, families, and tourists. The carriage shakes through the darkness. At stations, doors open, air rushes along the platform, and thousands of passengers move through connecting tunnels. What you cannot see is that government researchers have introduced a bacterial simulant into this system. The organism is not anthrax. It is Bacillus globigii, selected because scientists then considered it comparatively harmless and because its spores could imitate the movement of a biological weapon. Samples placed around the network allow researchers to measure where those spores travel. They want to know whether air currents, trains, and human movement could transform one release point into mass exposure. No informed consent. No public warning. The experiment is part of a much larger program. Between 1953 and 1976, Britain conducts numerous open-air trials intended to model biological attack. Substances are released from aircraft, vehicles, ships, and inside public spaces. Officials later say independent reviews found no adverse effects on the population. But the disturbing part is the mindset. The country itself had become a laboratory. To understand why officials were mapping invisible clouds beneath London, you have to return to 1942. Britain is fighting for survival. German bombing has devastated cities, invasion remains a recent fear, and military planners are considering weapons beyond anything used in conventional warfare. At Porton Down, a secret research program investigates biological agents. One organism stands above the rest, Bacillus anthracis, anthrax. Anthrax is especially useful to weapons scientists because it forms spores. These dormant structures can survive harsh conditions for years. When inhaled in sufficient quantities, they can produce a fast-moving and frequently fatal infection. The planners do not merely want a poison. They want something that can persist after release, contaminate ground, infect livestock, and deny territory to an enemy. But laboratory calculations are not enough. They need to watch a real biological cloud move through open air. That requires isolation. Their chosen testing ground is a small island off Scotland's northwest coast. Windswept, rocky, and separated from the mainland by cold water, it can be sealed from the public. Its military codename is X-Base. Its real name is Gruinard Island. The island is requisitioned from its owner, and teams arrive under strict security. Their equipment is ferried across the water. Sheep are transported with them, tethered in groups, and positioned at measured distances from the test apparatus. The animals are not incidental. They are the biological indicators. Scientists prepare anthrax spores designed for weapon use. In one trial, an explosive device is suspended near the sheep. Cameras roll from a distance. Protective clothing covers the observers. Then the device detonates. A dark cloud expands across the ground, carrying particles too small to see. Nothing happens immediately. That is what makes biological warfare so deceptive. There is no wall of fire, no crater large enough to explain the danger. The weapon enters the body silently. Over the following days, the exposed sheep become sick. They collapse and die. Post-mortem examinations confirm anthrax infection. Britain has demonstrated that an explosive weapon can disperse viable spores through the air. The test is considered a technical success. But success creates a problem nobody standing behind those cameras can easily solve. The weapon has not vanished after the cloud passes. It is still in the soil. Gruinard is already becoming untouchable. Yet the island trial is only one component of a plan far larger than a single bomb. British planners are preparing millions of small cattle cakes contaminated with anthrax. Aircraft could scatter them across enemy farmland. Cattle would eat them, herds would die, food supplies would collapse, and humans handling infected animals could also become casualties. The plan is codenamed Operation Vegetarian. It is never deployed. The infected cakes are ultimately destroyed after the war. But before we get to what happened to Gruinard, you need to understand something even stranger. The most successful part of the experiment was not proving that anthrax could kill. It was discovering that the island itself had become the weapon. When the trials end in 1943, the scientists leave behind a contamination problem unlike an ordinary chemical spill. Anthrax spores can remain dormant in soil. Rain does not reliably destroy them. Cold does not guarantee their death. If disturbed, contaminated earth may expose animals years later. Dead sheep are burned or buried. Equipment is treated. Access to the island is forbidden. Warning signs appear along the shore: government property, keep out, dangerous. Gruinard disappears from ordinary life. No permanent population returns. Boats pass it at a distance. Local residents live beside a patch of land the state has effectively removed from the map. And this lasts through the end of the Second World War. Through the birth of the nuclear age. Through Korea, Suez, the Beatles, and the moon landing. Decade after decade, soil samples continue to detect spores. That persistence explains the later simulations. If anthrax could transform an isolated island into contaminated ground for generations, what would happen if spores entered a city, a port, or an underground railway? The London passengers were not part of a disconnected experiment. They were walking through the next chapter of Gruinard. After the war, Britain publicly shifts away from an offensive biological weapons program. But defensive research continues, and defensive research still demands data. Scientists need to understand how microscopic particles disperse. So they conduct field trials using organisms and fluorescent tracers intended to simulate more dangerous agents. Clouds are released offshore to measure how winds carry them toward populated land. Other tests examine roads, buildings, and transportation systems. To officials, these are controlled studies of vulnerability. To the public, once the records emerge, they look like experiments performed on people who were never asked. That distinction matters. The London trial did not release anthrax, and claims that officials deliberately infected commuters with anthrax are false. But the bacterial simulant was real, the passengers were unaware, and the purpose was to model the behavior of a biological attack. Here is the contradiction. Britain quarantined one tiny island because biological contamination was too dangerous to ignore, while simultaneously using populated areas to study how contamination might spread. The same secrecy that protected the research also prevented the public from judging the risk. By 1981, Gruinard has been contaminated for almost 40 years. Then a group calling itself Dark Harvest Command forces the island back into the headlines. Activists claim to have landed there and collected soil. A package containing contaminated earth is left near the Portondown research facility. Another package is associated with a political gathering, though that sample reportedly contains no anthrax. The message is unmistakable: the government's abandoned experiment can be carried back to the mainland. This is not merely a protest. It is a demonstration of political leverage. A forbidden island cannot remain forgotten if someone can place part of it on an official doorstep. Public pressure builds. Scientists have already explored whether decontamination is possible, but now the legacy is impossible to treat as distant wartime history. The state has spent decades keeping people away from Gruinard. Now it must prove that Gruinard can be made safe. In 1986, decontamination teams return. They target the infected ground with a solution of formaldehyde diluted in seawater. The treatment is applied across the contaminated area, while some of the worst soil near the original detonation site is removed. Then comes the real test. The government cannot declare victory because the landscape looks clean. It must search for something microscopic that has already survived more than 4 decades. Teams collect soil cores. Laboratories examine samples. Sheep are returned to graze on the treated land as living indicators. They remain healthy. An independent advisory group concludes that the chances of a person or animal contracting anthrax on the island are now extraordinarily remote. On April 24, 1990, 48 years after the first wartime trials, the warning signs are removed. Gruinard is officially returned to civilian use. That is the answer hidden inside the title. Britain did not continuously detonate anthrax weapons there for decades. It conducted the lethal trials in 1942 and 1943. Then spent decades testing, monitoring, and confronting the contamination those experiments left behind. The trial lasted days. Its consequences lasted nearly half a century. Gruinard's history is disturbing without exaggeration. The island proves that biological weapons do not obey the clean timelines of military planning. A bomb explodes once. A spore can wait. The underground trial reveals a second danger: secrecy can turn ordinary citizens into unwitting participants, even when scientists believe the material is comparatively safe. Official reviews later concluded that Britain's open-air trials caused no adverse health effects in the population. That finding matters. So does the fact that people were denied the opportunity to consent or question the assumptions behind those trials. You are left with 2 versions of the same country. One is preparing for threats it fears may be used against millions. The other is creating hazards and ethical compromises that remain concealed for decades. Both versions are true. And that may be the darkest lesson of Gruinard Island. Governments do not need to invent fictional conspiracies when national security can make real decisions disappear into classified files. Today, the island is green again. Boats can approach. The warning signs are gone. But beneath that peaceful landscape sits a permanent reminder: one secret wartime decision can outlive the people who made it, and the public may not learn the full story until generations later. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next, the wind-scale fire released fallout Britain tried to hide, the nuclear accident officials tried to contain while radioactive material was already moving across the country.